we have all the pictures we are
recording these videos.
We would like to have you do all
That was something I had in one of my previous projects. That was
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming out to this evening. Everything that you could be doing, you're spending your evening with us, and we thank you for that. My name is Joe Henderson, and some of you may be looking at me like I'm the first tall person you've seen before, which is fine. Our deal is, you don't ask me if I play basketball, and I won't ask you if you play mini golf. This is a show that Gordon Walden and I do every month on the second Thursday of every month. We skipped last month because of stuff going on at Capital Factory, but we're always very glad that Capital Factory makes their facilities available to us. You may have noticed on the door that the classroom is now called Antone's. Even their staff was surprised by that this week. Apparently the other big room, which they just called the big room, is now called Austin City Limits. And apparently everything else on this floor has Austin music iconography and people attached. So, yeah, new things. So we actually have a sponsor this month that's paying for our food and drink this evening. And for the first time, I work for our sponsor, so I have a new job. Written up here on the board here, Hopf Institute has been in Austin since before 1984. It's when they incorporated. They're located within a short walk of West Campus at UT. They specialized in supplemental education such as tutoring, ESL, and integration of international students. But they are now branching into vocational education, and the first vocation they want to cover is video game development. This is not a term that usually gets applied to video game development vocation. We sometimes call it a job. We sometimes call it a job. What does this mean? This is addressing the fact that there are so many people who are training and going to school to learn the craft and the trade of game development, but there's a gap between the end of their studies and that first job. So there's a lot of potential reasons for that, and this is what the Game Design and Development Lab at gamedevelopmentlab.com, also at Twitter at Hopf Game Lab, is meant to address. Now, this is the kind of thing that basically everyone wants to happen. There's just been questions about exactly how to do it and who's actually going to take the step. But the gap between the people with the skills and the people who would like to hire people with skills, but maybe don't know them because they haven't built up enough of a reputation or a body of work or a reputation to be considered hireable. Thanks for coming in, by the way. I'm just talking to get everyone seated. What I'm doing, at least what needs to happen between now and January, is that we need students. So anyone who wants to go to the website and sign up, there's no commitment to that. So that's the easy part of the pitch. The difficult part is that there's a tuition attached, and it's $12,000. Now, anyone who signs up is approved by our instructors and commits to the payment will be discounted $1,000 to $11,000. And we've also partnered with an agency called Skills Fund, which specializes in workshops and boot camps. And this qualifies as a boot camp because it's only through January and August. So anyone who can commit to that can get in on the ground floor of what this is supposed to be. And a couple representatives, Hussein and Amreen, are here, and you can talk with me afterwards. And in any case, thank you very much for hearing my pitch.
Talk about the instructors.
The instructors.
I don't want to go to no damn school unless I hear about the instructors.
We have world-class instructors who start out with, thankfully the curriculum was not developed by me. Yeah, you don't want to be doing that. But Sarah Abraham, PhD recently from UT Computer Science. Chip, what's his last name?
I don't know how to pronounce it,
Yeah.
but
Subrogna, who has been a level designer and puzzle designer for such games as Metroid Prime 2, Portal 2, and Rise of the Tomb Raider. And Maya and Dreesen is our art instructor. And they will be in charge of reviewing all the applications once they start coming in. Again, all this is coming within a very short amount of time. And again, if there's any questions about it, please let me know. We're actually going to have one of the events that I put on the calendar on December 2nd, and I have yet to actually send this out, but we'll be banging the drum very soon this week. On December 2nd at the Hopkins Institute offices, we are going to do a portfolio posse. This is something that I haven't done in years, and now it's actually a professional endeavor. What it is a one-on-one opportunity to have your resume and portfolio reviewed by a professional. And it's going to be on a Saturday afternoon from like 1 o'clock to 4. And this is actually open to everyone. So if you have something ready and want to have some review before you commit to the program, please come on by. Thanks for coming by, everyone. Please grab something to drink and pizza before you sit down.
Excuse me, I want to let people know that Sarah right now teaches computer in computer science for game design, and she's been approved by UT to teach this course. But this is an evening course.
That's right.
So it's not.
Oh, it's evenings only, yeah.
To start Mondays and Wednesdays, and then Monday, Wednesday, Friday after the first 2 months. And another thing that I'm going to need to start doing is making connections with local developers, because the work that has been done for classwork is supposed to be the kind of stuff that's actually in production. So this will, in its best form, will be a de facto outsourcing agency to the local studios.
So the students are gonna actually build a game, so they'll have something for their resume. Yeah.
Well, they'll be doing work that gets used in games.
Right.
It may not be the only game that they want to work, but again, people go in professionally to make the game that other people want to pay them to work on. So it's going to be like that. So this is meant as a supplement to existing game programs, and Austin has quite a lot of them. And if you go around and talk to a lot of people, a lot of them are coming straight out of college into the first job, but that's not true for everyone. So there may be some arguments to be made about the amount of time you spend in a 4-year program and whether that's enough time to build a portfolio. Yes, Wes?
So what's the actual class? I hear that I'm paying money to work for free.
No, that wouldn't be the point. But I will definitely answer your questions offline. Okay. Anyway, now is the time when we talk about jobs, people who would like them and people who would like to hire people. Let's start on this side of the room. Who is looking for a job? And please keep it short, but identify yourself by your name, your specialty, and whether you have business cards on our website. We'll start with you. Yes.
My name is Christina Christopherson. I specialize in character design and 2D generalist. I have business cards and website.
I'm Joseph Santee. I specialize in writing and audio design. I have business cards as well as resume. I don't have an official website, just my LinkedIn has a current which needs updating.
Going back.
I'm Garrett Hale. I do a lot of C++ game making stuff. Got a website, gert.us.
Games are software development, so coders are definitely needed. Yeah. Anyone on this side? All right, we'll start over here.
Chris Hatch. I have LinkedIn, GitHub. I do mostly C++ game development stuff. Other than that, if anybody wants to chat, I'd be happy to give that information.
On the way back.
My name is Layla Mamadova. I'm also a 2D character designer, and I have business cards and a website. And come see me for
I always like hearing when people bring business cards. I don't have to make fun. This is a networking event. You're supposed to do that. Any more folks? All right, now, how about people who have jobs to advertise?
You want me to? Okay. My name's Tyler. I'm an animator at Certain Infinity, and we are looking for several positions. I would recommend going to certaininfinity.com. And just for the art stuff, real quick, we have a senior environmental artist, a lead character artist, director of technical art, a UI artist, and a senior animator. And I also have business cards.
Very good. Very important. A very nice business cards. There's been some, well, studios laying people off in the news lately. Don't want to jinx it, but they're not in Austin right now. But you know, everyone who's listening from Telltale and Rune and Motaiga, he's at Seattle. Austin, they're game companies that need talent like yours, so.
I'm looking for a mid-level or senior Unity gameplay program.
Very good. So remember, everyone.
And I have cards and everything.
Yes. But, we'll make it a goal tonight, as we have time, to meet someone you didn't know, and there's a lot of faces I've not seen before. Who hasn't been to one of these shows before? That's about a little more than a third. There's one. All right. So again, we do this every second Thursday of the month. We'll be coming back in December, whatever day that is, with Tim Porter from Underminer Studios. And in January, I'm bringing Microtalks back. This is a show that I've been doing years ago. In fact, I featured our speaker tonight. Unfortunately, the video wasn't good, so we didn't get to capture that. But this is a show where all the speakers only get 10 minutes at the podium, and they're all on a topic, and the topic is audience. So I get to revive it and call it Season 3. So anyway, we're very much looking forward to this. So I think it's time to introduce our speaker. She's from a far-flung place called Connecticut. Started her career in Boston at companies like Demiurge and Irrational, where she worked on Bioshock Infinite. And for the past 3.5 years, she's been in Austin, and this year she was promoted to senior level designer at Certain Affinity, which means she worked on a lot of games this year, mostly multiplayer. But she has quite a long experience, and I'll let her take the floor. That's Frankie Schwartz.
Schwartz, as John introduced me. I was going to go through my career. I guess I'll still briefly talk about it. But so I started out in Boston, Massachusetts, working at a bunch of different studios there. Started out on Lord of the Rings Online, Mines of Moria, which is an MMORPG. And then I worked on a small XBLA title, which was a side-scrolling cooperative platformer shooter called Shoot Mini Robots. And then I worked for 3 years at Irrational Games, working as a level designer on Bioshock Infinite, and then the 3 DLCs, including Barrel at Sea. And then, you know, the big thing happened with Irrational Games, and then they kind of were like, hey, we want to go indie now. So that's when I moved to Austin, Texas. And I joined Certain Affinity here. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what Certain Affinity does, we work with a lot of other AAA studios, and we kind of take a chunk of the game and help them finish out the game in a co-development type of environment. So while I've been at Certain Affinity, I've had the opportunity to work on the multiplayer for Doom and Mafia 3, which is an open world single player game, and the remaster of Call of Duty Modern Warfare. And so what I'm going to be covering today is kind of the paradigm shift that occurred for me when I moved here in 2014, coming from designing very heavily narrative-based single-player, first-person shooter type levels like Bioshock Infinite, and then making this huge shift into designing multiplayer levels. And I wanted to talk about kind of the lessons learned about, specifically in level design, things that I learned where I should be focusing on, or what you all should be focusing on in general when you're looking at a multiplayer level design as compared to designing for a single player narrative experience. And I do want to specify that each game type is different, and part of a level designer's job is to figure out what's fun about each type of game and try to make a level that supports that. And so, although there's a lot of similarities in terms of you know, applicable things like architecture and lighting and psychological, you know, thoughts and framing and things, and playable spaces that are fun, there is some differences when you're thinking about designing for each type of level. So I wanted to clarify that I'm taking 2 types of examples here in the many assortments of the styles of games out there. And so I want to talk about designing layouts first. You know, when you're starting out designing a level, on a paper map, you know, you're trying to think about, okay, what kind of size level do I want to make? And when you are building a single player level, usually this is the time where you're thinking about, okay, you know, how long is this experience of this game and what chunk of that is going to be in this level. So are you creating a game that's expected to be a 12-hour game? Is this level going to be a half an hour amount of time experience, or is it going to be a 2-hour really long drawn out experience? And in addition to that, you're also trying to think about some things early on. You might have this information, you might not, but if you do, it's great to think about it. You know, how many combats are you planning to have in that space? How big are they going to be? You know, what is the length of time you want to be in those combats? Are there any planned narrative sets or beats in that space? Are they going to be big or small? Are you going to be having any traversal style conversations? You know, in Bioshock Infinite, we often had the main character conversing with the side companion character Elizabeth, and you would be running around a space and she would be telling you about things that are going on or her perspective on things. And so when you're creating a size of a level, you need to think about buffering that if that narrative conversation is really important. And in addition to that, any side quests you might have or additional content. And obviously, a lot of the times you might not have all this information right away. Some of this you might have to change your design later to compensate. I know that I was working on the level of Finkton on Bioshock Infinite, and that level was one of the oldest levels in the game. And I adopted it from somebody else, and it changed so many times because the narrative changed or the combats changed. And so you might have a great idea for what the size of what you want it to be, but just keep in mind that it will definitely change over time. Whereas when you're designing a multiplayer game, a level for like a team deathmatch or you know, a player versus player type of level, you're trying to think about the size in terms of how many players are in your game. You know, are you making a 2v2 level? You know, is it going to be like a very small, confined level? You can be creating this massive level with lots of players. How long is the size of the team? You're also trying to think about what is the intended time until engagement. So that means how long from when the players spawn and then they encounter each other. So for a game like Doom, the intended time until engagement is a lot shorter than, say, a game like World of Tanks. And so in Doom, it's a very quick-paced game, and people just rush up against each other really quickly, and it's very frenetic. Whereas World of Tanks is a multiplayer game with on giant maps, and everyone's in tanks, and there's fog of war type mechanics where nobody knows where anybody is until they slowly get to see each other. So designing a level for a Doom type game will be a lot smaller than for a World of Tanks type game. But even when you are starting out for designing for a multiplayer level, something that I did personally was try to push the boundaries and see how small and how big can you go. So making every single level the same size is okay, but it's more fun, I think, over an overall experience to have a variety of sizes of levels. So taking time to experiment how small is too small before it just feels confined and unfair, and how big is too big before players just get bored. So once you have a general idea of what is the size of these levels, this is when you are starting to actually define your layouts a bit more and trying to think about framing and composition. And some of this goes into a bit more environmental art or level architects or other things, other roles that the level designer might be working with. But I think it's important for level designers, even in the early gray box block out stages, to think about this kind of stuff. And so in general, what I found when I worked on single-player narrative games and made levels for that as compared to multiplayer competitive levels, I found that I really needed to make sure to focus in single-player on storytelling the most. And in multiplayer, it doesn't matter as much. And in single-player, it's important to design a layout that really displays any story moments and any gameplay objectives that you have. Whereas in multiplayer, the most important thing is to make sure that all the player paths are really focused and drawn attention to and really clear and transparent to the players. And also super important in multiplayer is tightening up any sightlines or exploits. And so I'm going to go into these a little bit more because these are kind of broad categories. So when you're trying to think about, how can I sell or make sure to focus on narrative elements when I'm designing a level, it's important to try to either create bottleneck situations or identify any bottlenecks you might have in your layout. And so what I mean by bottleneck is that in a first-person game, the player might be running around looking wherever they want, and if the game is not heavily cutscene scripted and relies on the player to just happen to look at important narrative things, level design is a great tool to subtly encourage players to look places, and bottlenecks are like places that you know that the player will be going through or have to go through, and so that you have a pretty good idea that you know where players are going to be looking at these certain points. So for example, you all walk through that one door right here to get into the room. Who knows where everyone was walking around and looking at? There's no guarantee that anyone's looking at John right now, but we know that that door exit there, everyone's going to be looking at there. So trying to work with your artists to make sure that narrative moments can be told through those bottlenecks. Another type of bottleneck that you can also use is something called the T-junction. And so that's generally a kind of a straight path that ends, and the player can go left or right of it. So in the example here, the player has entered a T-junction and they can go left or right, and so the level designer worked with artists to make sure that the narrative moments were displayed here. And in addition to these kinds of bottlenecks, there's also players, if they walk up or down a stairs, that moment where they exit or enter the stairway, or maybe they are stuck in an elevator for a certain amount of time. Like all these kinds of things are opportunities to tell stories and work with your artists to get those stories told. Also, something that's a bit more level designery is something that is referred to as weenies, which is a Walt Disney term. He found that his dogs would follow him around when he had hot dog or weenie in his hand, and so he saw that that was a way to guide and direct the dog to places. And so when he was designing, theme parks, he was trying to think of applying that in the layout of the park. And so things like Cinderella's castle, which is a very notable, distinctive, iconic thing that you can see from almost anywhere in the park, and it's a place where people can use as a point of reference. And it's a great thing to include in your level layouts as a way to make sure that people know where they are in a space in relation to everywhere else in a level, and also to pull players to a certain location. So for example, in Bioshock Infinite, one of the early levels, the player first enters this city in the sky, Columbia, and they know that they are trying to find this young woman named Elizabeth, who is in this tower. And one of the first scenes in Columbia, the player exits this archway, once again, kind of restricting the player in a bottleneck. And that moment is used to display this giant statue of an angel where Elizabeth is being held. And as you can see in the right, this is kind of a high-level image of the whole level. And so no matter where you are in the level, you can see this overarching thing, and you know that's where, the player knows that's where they need to get to. And so this is a very dramatic, blunt way to use Omni. I think that it wouldn't necessarily be an excellent, applicable way to do it for every type of level that you're working on. Especially, you know, if you did this in every single level in an entire game, it would really get tedious very quickly. But I think in this example it works because it's very early and the player has just entered the city and they don't know anything about the city yet. And so this very dramatic example works. But you can also use more subtle examples like maybe you enter a level on the top of a ridge and you look down and far away down below you can see a crashed airplane and you know that's where you need to get to. And so you might not know exactly how to get there, but you know that's your general path that you want the player to go. So in single player, that's kind of what you're trying to think about when you're framing or creating layouts, is to try to make sure that the player understands why they are in the space. It's important to make sure that the level communicates why the player is there. So what is the player's motivation in the space? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to get somewhere, you know, or are they trying to figure out something within an environment? And using the layouts to do that is really important in single player. Whereas in multiplayer, if you're creating a game that has objectives, it is important to have some elements of that, you know, like in Halo here, you know, making sure that the flag capture points are really clearly defined is important. But most of your time and focus is usually going to be on making sure that you really call out all player path options and make sure to work with artists to make sure that all of the different areas are really clear. And you're trying to think about creating many different ways that the players can move around the space over time, because players are going to be playing these levels over and over again. It's not just the one-time viewing in a single-player game that you think about. In multiplayer, you have to think about players playing your level over and over again. So including more complex routes is a great way to do it. And it's also important to make sure that when you're designing a layout, that it's very clear to players in a split-second judgment where that path is going to lead. I know I personally played a few multiplayer levels where I knew I wanted to flank someone and get to a spot, and I took a path that did like a 180 and took me in a completely opposite direction. And I really do not like levels that are designed that way, because players have a broad sense of the level and they generally want to go a certain direction, and so making it clear where a path is generally going to be going. And obviously having small little secrets or hidden areas is awesome as well, and all that. So the biggest difference I found when starting to design for multiplayer levels was the amount of time I needed to do passes of all the sight lines in a level. It's really critical to do a thorough pass of this. In a single player game, if there is an opportunity for a player to get a very teeny advantage or a view that isn't intended over an NPC, it's not a huge deal. You know, NPCs don't have feelings. But in a multiplayer game, you know, if a player gets this like teeny little view in between columns and they shoot somebody who didn't see them, that person who died is going to be pissed. And so I found that I had to spend so much more time at really tightening up all the sight lines in a level. And so this is kind of an early example of a level that I was working on, a small room in a larger level as an example of this. So this is kind of a top-down view here, and the darker gray represents a lower height, and the lighter gray represents a higher height, and so there's a staircase there. And in the octagons there are representative of pillars, and the brown boxes are doors. And so the player can either enter from the right or the top. And so I was thinking, oh cool, the player will either go around these pillars, and then it'll be equally distant from each other and it'll flow really nicely, or the player can go down the lower path and then double jump and mantle up onto the top, and it'll be awesome. And then I found that if somebody stands in that red X there, they can get this little teeny view through both of the pillars out the door to people running across outside, and the people outside couldn't see that person because it's a very small view, and it was very frustrating for players to do that. And so trying to really think about doing multiple passes of looking at all these sight lines and fixing all of them up, or designing from the start to avoid these. And so in this case, I think I moved the door to the left a little bit more and made that the top octagon a little bit bigger to kind of close it up so that you couldn't get that same advantage. And so once you have the general layout, you want to start thinking about any optional or advanced routes that you want to add to your level, and maybe you started out with these, or maybe you need to add them later. But in single player, the focus is usually these optional side routes is another opportunity to tell stories. It's trying to think about, maybe this area won't necessarily be used for combat, maybe it's not the most ideal combat space in the world, but maybe it's great for narrative, and so designing a layout that supports that. And so in this example here, there's this this basement of this bar in a shanty town in Bioshock Infinite, where you can go down the stairs, and there's this guitar on a chair, and if the player interacts with it, they start strumming the guitar, and Elizabeth plays this scene of her singing this melancholy song, and she interacts with this little boy who comes up the stairs. And so the layout here, with only one entrance at the top and a staircase around, isn't really necessarily the best combat space. There's no cover, there's no, there's only one route down, and it would be awful for combat. But when designing the layout of this space, it was designed to think about, okay, how can we create this view that looks great, and how can we kind of encourage the player to interact with this object. And it's kind of hard to tell because this is a first-person game, but imagine the player's sitting exactly where the camera is, and so that chair with the guitar on it is directly straight when you go down the stairs. So you go down the stairs, and then there's the chair. John's the chair, and is the stairs. So thinking about how to encourage interactions that you might want optionally for the player. Also, additional areas in single player is a great time to reward the player. Secret areas that the player feels rewarded to find. In multiplayer, that's a good thing to do too, but in single player, it's a great opportunity to have cool loot, or new narrative tidbits, or callbacks to previous games, or Easter eggs, things like that. In this area here, the player had to solve this puzzle in the Barrel at Sea DLC for Bioshock Infinite. You kind of went back to Rapture from Bioshock 1. And if you did this puzzle, you got access to this secret space area where you found all these wigs and an audio log referencing a character from the first Bioshock game, Frank Fontaine, who is a deceptive person, and I don't want to, well, it's old game, whatever. You know, like he deceives the player, and so it's kind of a callback for that. And so it's a great way to think about creating like a puzzle in a level, even if your game isn't puzzle centric. Creating like a simple puzzle to open up an area to reward the player is a great little tidbit to add in a single player game. My voice is so hoarse. Yeah, and one thing to think about though, when you're creating alternate routes is that it's great to add alternative play styles into the design of your layout. You know, are there going to be stealth options? Are you going to support sniping? Are you going to create a vantage point where the player can snipe down? But you really need to think about what that means and communicate with your AI programmers on that, because you have to make sure that the AI will play nice. So like a simple game, maybe you just have like short and long range weapons, that's easy. But if you all of a sudden want to add a level where you have stealth and you want to add, you know, vents, in a game like Deus Ex, where it's a central focus of part of the game where you can sneak around, and vents are an opportunity to view things from a safe perspective, and also a way to knock out people and hide them so that their buddies don't find it. You know, that was embedded into the game. But if you just decide, hey, I want to create, you know, this little tunnel vent area where I want to go in, and the player can have this as an option, it can be good to do that as a one-off part of a single player game, but you have to make sure that the AI plays okay, because if you are in an event that the enemy AIs can't get to, how will they respond to that? It can feel really bad. And if the AI, if you're just down at the ground shooting AI's feet, or if you're up high and shooting enemies who can't really do anything back to you, like say if you only have melee enemies in that area, might want to consider adding an enemy with a ranged attack instead. Something else is with sniping. I think sniping is really tricky in a lot of layouts because it can be very overpowered. For example, I was playing Far Cry 3, which there's a picture of it on the right, and there's a lot of defensible, you know, fortresses that you can optionally encounter in the game, but a lot of the layouts were designed kind of this basin with a hill up top. And once I got the sniper, it was over, because I would just perch up on the hill and just shoot everyone down at the bottom. And the problem is that the AI couldn't really do anything about it. Most of the encounters didn't really have any snipers for me to fight against to be a threat. So all the enemies were very short, much shorter range weapons. And so they would just try to run up to me, you know, like in this picture, they would run up in that back left path and go all the way around. And by that point, I had like way too much time to reload, and I just kept, you know, shooting them and taking them out, and it wasn't a challenge anymore. And so if you're going to be adding, you know, sniping as an alternate route or space, either trying to restrict it to very specific site areas where they only have a limited site that you control, or making sure that the AIs are designed in a way that plays nicely with a more open space with a sniper. So, you know, maybe you talked with your AI programmers and said, hey, if the AI detects that they are getting hit from this far away, have them throw a grenade at you to kind of force you out into another area and kind of rattle you a little bit so you don't have as much time to shoot everyone, and then they have time to come get you. Or maybe the AI will hide behind cover or in houses or things when they detect they're being shot from further away. So when you're designing like for multiple play styles, making sure that the AI can support that kind of layout is really important. Whereas in multiplayer, you still have the same level of, you should really design a layout to support many different play styles, but you also want to support advanced skills over time. So because players are going to be playing these multiplayer levels over and over again, you want to create many more options than a single player game, so that players have a wide variety of ways that they can move around the space, and the encounters don't become as boring and fixed as, like, say, a 1v1 encounter in the same hallway over and over again. And so creating more options, more spaces that have different styles, and also more difficult routes that players can master over time. And so this is one of the levels from Doom multiplayer. And so in this example here, the player could, like, run up and then jump onto the platform, and then double jump in the air onto the platform on the right. Say they're fighting against somebody on the right. And so if somebody's really good at air control and double jumping, they can use that to their advantage. Where if somebody else is not the best at double jumping, they might just go straight and then do a single jump up and then mantle up onto the top. And maybe they will fight the other enemies in the area below, and they have more control over themselves. Here is a more advanced, skillful route that players can take, where they can, still jump up on that middle platform, but then they'll double jump to the side to jump on this teeny little ledge that's about like a third or a quarter of the size of a normal size ledge. And so it's really difficult to land that, but if players do, they have a great view from an alternate perspective, and it's a way for players to feel satisfied with themselves when they've mastered it, and they get to jump on other players who might be new in a space, but still in a fair way. And so pickups, loot, and power-ups are obviously, for most games, they're pretty important, so we're talking, loot that replenishes ammo or health, or if you have magic in your game, mana or things like that, or maybe you have a cool badass, power weapon or power up in the game. So in single player, I keep saying this, but like telling stories, I think when I worked at Irrational on Bioshock, pretty much everything was about stories. So it was like, any opportunity that you can tell a story is great. So everyone on the team would, in their discipline, find a way to support either the macro high-level story of the world, or smaller level as what is going on right now, or what happened right before the player got there. So in this example here, there's this knocked over pickup that's like this gear stuff that you can equip. But, and so it doesn't happen that often. And so instead of just plopping it in the middle of the space or right next to that elevator in the back, a scene was created where the overarching narrative before the player entered this space is that there was this rebellion of the worker class, the Vox Populi, and they were fighting against the police of Colombia. And so you're kind of following behind that, and so you get into the space and you see a scene with, like, corpses of policemen and explosions, and so you see this like story of what's going on. But there's also, somebody was also transporting some goods around before this happened, and so using loot to tell stories is a great opportunity in single player games. It's great if you have loot that is physical objects that relate to the real world. So instead of just having a health pack, having food items or other things, so you can create a little scene. Like, say you want to put on a ledge like a beer and a banana. Somebody was taking their lunch break, and it's a great way to make the world feel lived in, even if you don't have the full, even if your game in that moment doesn't have people running around it at the moment. It makes it feel like people in the world used to be there before you got there. Now, in multiplayer, it's a much different idea of thinking about pickups and power-ups. Whereas in single player, you're usually thinking about replenishing things that players lose over time. So, putting it, interdispersed throughout the game or before or after a big fight. In multiplayer, usually you're trying to use that as a way to draw players in, almost like a weenie, kind of what I was talking about before. So in single player, you're kind of laying pickups on top of existing, an existing levels design. Whereas in multiplayer, especially games that have, power weapons or power-ups or pickups, it's really critical to use and to design that into your level when you're designing your layout, not adding it in on top. It's much more difficult to add it in on top later and make it really work. So in this example here, this is a level from Doom, and this is the middle thing is something called the Demon Rune, where in the multiplayer game, players have normal, well, not 100% normal weapons, but the general types of weapons a first-person shooter might have. But this pickup here, power-up, sorry, when the player gets it, they turn into this massive demon, and then they can like rampage around the level, and so it's a really big draw, and so players will often fight over it, which means that the space around a pickup needs to support intense fights over the space. So if you just put this like little demon rune in like a closet or a hallway or something, that's not going to create the best experience for players. And so pickups need to be a part of the level design itself. So next section, I'm going to be talking about exploits. So in single player, although it's important to look at exploits in the game, we've all seen those like, speed running videos where players find this little area where they can get to this unexpected space. Exploits are not super critical to fix as compared to multiplayer designing. So in single player, usually you're trying to focus on making sure that players don't get stuck somewhere and they're still able to progress. So if players get some sort of exploit or unintended design advantage that the designer did not intend in a single player game, it's not a huge deal. Like what I was talking about before, NPCs don't have feelings, but in multiplayer, usually players are playing against other real people, and real people have feelings, and they get frustrated and rage quit when they feel like they lost because of something that was beyond their control. So if players feel like they understand why they did not succeed, that's fine, you can progress over time. But if there's instances where it feels unfair, it can be very frustrating and really turn people away too early from your game. And in multiplayer, it takes a lot more time to look into all of these things, and it's really high consequences if you ship with this and then you have to patch it later. I mean, like, there's some fun exploits, I remember, like, in, like, Halo, you could rocket jump to get to certain places, and that was fun, but as a new player, I remember, like, being frustrated because I couldn't get to those areas, and I think that would have been fun to intentionally design for that kind of mechanic and create that so it's a more advanced skill that players can use and it feels satisfying when you actually do it. I practiced at home and finally got to do it a couple times, and so that was really fun. And so that level of advancing your skills and finding fun little things is great, but it doesn't feel great for the other people. And so some exploits might be okay, but many that feel super unfair really need to be fixed. And so that goes into playtesting. And so coming from working on single player games and then switching to multiplayer games, I found the playtesting methodology is completely different. So in single player, especially if it's a linear game where players are generally only going to be playing them once. You only get one shot at a first impression. So in the regular game, players will only see something once. And so when you're playtesting, you want to save people as long as possible so they're not tainted and get a good first impression. So that means that you're usually spending more time developing the level out a bit more, adding a bit more polish to it. Not 100% polish, but usually you want to bring it to a further state, like 70% is a big number, but like a lot more, whereas in multiplayer you'd be okay with a little bit rougher, because in single player, you really want to make sure that players see the critical gameplay objectives and see critical narrative things and, understand what's going on. And so, having, people play less and play less in between play tests is more important. But it also means that you are going to have to expect that you are going to be doing a lot more work in between iterations, and that means that you're going to be throwing away a lot more work. So, you're going to have to create more stuff, and then if it doesn't work, you might be able to patch it up and fix things, or you might need to completely restart things over and over again. I know at Irrational we had we threw away a lot of stuff. Let's just say that. But we did find that when looking at general playtesting feedback, it was more useful to bring it to a later state. But that doesn't mean that you can't have people on your team to playtest early on. It's really useful to determine who on your team is great at extrapolating content. So looking at something that's just simple gray box and a character in a T-pose just sliding around a space, and being able to visualize what that's going to look like later on. And usually if you have somebody with more experience with level design or environmental art, those are great people to pull from earlier on, and then you can do smaller iterations. In single player, it's really important to make sure that players don't get lost. And I don't want to say that you have to handhold players around a space, or players need to be able to know exactly how to get to somewhere, but players need to have a general concept of a space and not be turned around and going the opposite direction and not have any concept of what environment they're in is. And so in single player, because you often only have that one experience for players, making sure they don't get lost is super important, because they should know their motivation and where they are in the space. In comparison, when I started at Certain Affinity and we were working on my first multiplayer game, I found that we play tested every single day, and that was a real shock for me, because I was used to previously having level design play tests maybe once every other week or so, and then having maybe once a month play tests with a creative director, and then maybe once every couple month play tests with external people. And so when I started on multiplayer, every single day we would play test all the levels that we were working on. And so what that meant was that I could just take things in gray box and build them out, and then the next day test them. And so the iteration cycle was really quick. And because it's multiplayer and you don't have that just one shot, you don't have to worry as much about having the same players over and over again, because the views of the players over time matters more than a first impression. And because players are going to be playing them over and over again, seeing how people on your team or other playtesters respond to playing the same level over and over again is really important. So if players get lost and are not able to make a good high-level mental model 3D idea in their head of the whole level that they are running around in, it's not a huge deal. I think in general, a lot of people might not be able to understand a whole map in the first try. But if, it's like the third or fourth time and they still like get turned around and are lost, then that would be something definitely to fix. And that's something that can, for getting lost, that's like a whole talk in itself, I think, in multiplayer games. I'm not a huge fan of symmetrical design of maps because that tends to encourage players to get lost. But it's harder to balance for a game that's not symmetrical. So, in summary, single player, as I keep saying, the focus most of my time when I'm designing for a single player level is trying to figure out how do I sell the narrative in every single way possible. From the high level layout design, trying to think about not just placing random boxes everywhere and then having art come in and assigning meaning to it later. I'm trying to think about this world that I'm creating a level in. What are the values of the people in that space? What are these spaces going to be used for? How does that influence the overall story, or even like the small micro level as well? Trying to design spaces or identify spaces that would be great for telling stories. And also trying to polish and make sure that you're framing gameplay objectives and designing routes for rewards and play styles. And in comparison, if you're creating a multiplayer game, if it is a competitive style game, there are a lot of games that are multiplayer or cooperative where people are progressing through a story, or maybe something like an MMORPG, like WoW or Lotro or something. Telling stories through the environment can be great, but if you're creating, something like a traditional first-person shooter multiplayer level like Halo or COD or Doom, then usually narrative is pretty low priority. I think I kind of had to train that out of myself a little bit. I was spending way too much time trying to think about, but what if, who was here before I got here, and what are these spaces being used for? And someone's like, that's just hell, just, just like, I'm like, no, but what are the demons doing there? Like, what are they doing when I'm not there? And so, like, I was spending way too much time, like, and mental energy thinking about that kind of stuff, and I realized that I needed to be spending more time thinking about the layout itself and exploits instead of trying to assign a meaning, especially in a meaningless environment. Yeah. So, yeah, that's my talk.
Yay. Before we get to the questions, though, let's take a break. Take out your timepieces. Count down 10 minutes from now. Have another drink, and please eat our pizza. Restrooms are down the hall and first left, and we'll be back. Yeah.
I know I've heard of one and two.
Back in the day, I like like Tuesday, kind of like we were still talking, but we still had that kind of I guess
I remember when it first came
I'm one of those that like, the same one turned out to be saying kind of like widow.
He's checking me I've never done never went that
When you say shit, you're already That's all right, yeah. That's why I'm going to like skip just a very that'll go the other way around. It's pretty fast. Most of the time right now to sleep out next to the browser. On purpose, but we're like, you push it through your past like working and like what's called the one I like the most, you have the same thing, and like, oh my god. Not good for me. No, anytime you have like, releasing super fast, it's a touch. Right after leading JavaScript framework right now actually works every single time you have to update. Got into the industry now. I was those differences it applies them to so by creating an entire abstraction layer, that's how that goes. In order to speed it up, you have to go through the recall. Right now, what I'm waiting for we're not comparing what I was going to do now. I believe like it's now like after
Probably a lot more hobbyist I'm really happy that what I had to draw was
They'll be like, hey, we need all of this.
Ow, my foot! Old camp counselor trick. So one thing I didn't mention, there's a couple things going on that I didn't write. One thing I didn't write on the calendar is the VR Austin jam this weekend. And actually on Monday, if you don't want to participate but just want to see what's going on, this is all happening at the Impact Hub offices. That's right, isn't it? On North Lamar? Yeah, I think that's right. We do have a bartender tonight. Katie has been servicing you all night. Phrasing. But please tip her. She does have a tip jar on her way out. And there is one thing I did write on the calendar. Game On. This is happening at the Bullock Museum of Texas History. Which one is it? North? Yeah, north of the Capitol building. Organized by the Austin Chronicle and South by Southwest. It is a showcase of games made in Austin, and Hop Institute will be there with their own table. So, oh yeah, if you park in the garage, please make sure before you leave to visit the desk out front here and get a validation card so you can get out for $5 instead of $20. And please, if you have anything to let Gordon and I know about, please use the meetup page to just give any kind of feedback. So let's get that back up for questions. I had a question. How much of your job involves thinking about performance? Like when you're showing the top down of the level with the 2 pillars, I was also thinking in terms of what behavior comes about when you're able to see way more of the level than you really needed to. When you're using the level layout to hide unimportant parts of the level so it doesn't lag.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I was talking to him earlier about this. When on Bioshock Infinite, originally there was a lot more skylines in the game than there ended up shipping with. Originally I had designed a level that had lots of tall buildings and 2 different skylines interlooping and swooping between each other, and it was really fun for combat to have the enemies down and be able to shoot at them and then jump off and fight people. But Bioshock Infinite was at the tail end of PS3 and previous Xbox, and so especially it was performance was awful because a skyline it's a roller coaster, and when you're looking really high and seeing everything, you can see everything and it renders everything. And so once we got a better idea as to the performance of what we were doing, a few of the levels had to be completely redesigned, or trying to figure out ways to block sightlines. And so in multiplayer, sightlines are important for combat because it doesn't feel fun to see to have somebody kill you, but it's also important for performance and trying to think about making sure there's not this one really long sight into a space. So like if you were designing, imagine all of these are buildings here, all these tables, having somebody just look straight through here, you might want to try to think about staggering some of those buildings. So that's definitely a part of designing a level. And so that's usually either that or trying to think about, in a single player game, what NPCs are in space and what animations are they playing, and are they moving around the space? Are they using the nav mesh or not? Is definitely something, that's the performance for single player that usually I'm focused on as a designer. On Bioshock Infinite, we had 2 different types of non-combat NPCs. Ones that would just stay in place, and if you shot, they would just cower, and then they would hide when you were looking at them. And then there were ones that actually could go on paths and move around and interact with different points to do animations, and they could also run away if they wanted, or you could script them or something. And so the ones that would stay in place and just play animations, they were just meshes that would play animations, and so they were a lot cheaper to use. And so sometimes like on a single player game, usually I'm doing a lot of scripting to build life into a space, and scripting NPCs to do things, or enemies to do things. And so thinking about performance in terms of how many different animations am I referring to in a space, or all that kind of stuff. I think usually art tends to deal a bit more in the like how high poly is this model realm.
Any other questions for Ben?
You mentioned that players tend to get lost in symmetrical multiplayer levels. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so in a symmetrical level, like a mirror image of each other, it can, if you're moving around a space, especially in a type of game where you're respawning at different areas in the map, you might not know exactly what area of the map you're in if you can't see it. And I know, like, if it's a small level, what's the name of that? The Warlock from Halo? It's a small four-sided symmetrical level, but it's so small that, and you could see everything, that it didn't matter and players wouldn't get lost. But if you're creating a big level with lots of smaller, tight areas, and you want to make sure the players feel like they're in control instead of being guided by the level designer, it's better to not create symmetrical levels. That's my personal stance. I know every level designer has different opinions. I think asymmetrical sounds like it's not balanced, but it still is symmetrical and balanced even if it isn't in the layout. So, you know, one advantage here has to be equidistant from both sides. A game like, you know, Gears of War's multiplayer, a symmetrical level might be okay because everyone spawns in their spawning area and everyone fights and then they respawn back in the same area, and so it doesn't matter. But if your respawns are randomly interspersed in the environment, then it feels like you are just letting the level, the player would feel like they're just letting the level guide them around instead of making intelligent, educated decisions as to where they want to go in space.
So I think you were trying to clarify that, but because if it's a team-based side, I was the level design manager for Wargaming, so World of Tanks and such. And one of the things that I did not like mirroring, but what I did and I instructed was on tessellation, which is actually when you rotate one, so you literally have exactly the same map, 180 on the other way, and you can interlock them like a yin yang or whatever. But the idea is that you have a chess map, basically.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
It's equal and fair. But as long as it's on a team side, I see what you're saying. If the map does not have a team side, then making symmetrical maps would be very discombobulating for the player and have little or to no meaning.
Yeah.
But from a team map, I have found that in studying all the maps of all the games, that players chose the maps that were most symmetrical in battle. And actually in tanks, we had to start fixing that and making it more like that because it felt unfair when it's a team side.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
I
Yeah,
guess that'd be
World
different.
of Tanks is like Gears of War, where you're starting at the beginning and you're encountering. It's not like the tanks are
I think it'd be
randomly
different,
spawning in
like a
random
death
places.
match versus
Yeah,
a team match.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So like in a Halo or a Call of Duty, where people are randomly spawning different places in the level, that's when I prefer asymmetrical. I definitely would agree with that. And just like anything else in level design, it really depends on the type of game you're working on. So these grand statements that people make, like myself, you know, in this presentation about certain things might not apply 100% to the types of game that you try to make. And that's why I try to specify, you know, single player narrative FPS versus, you know, a deathmatch style multiplayer game. So.
Kind of spills over into single player too, doesn't it? The redundancy?
I'm sorry, what?
Kind of spills over into single player narrative with redundancy, doesn't it?
What specifically?
Symmetry. Just too much. If it's a very large map and it looks all the same. I mean, I guess you could make an argument that you can change up the environment a bit too, so.
I think it would depend what type of experience you're trying to create. Are you trying? I don't know if I can think of any symmetrical levels in a single player game.
If you're playing Sokobang or something.
What was that?
The old pushing the blocks around, puzzle game.
Oh yeah, puzzle games have their own level design rules. Yep.
So how much creative freedom did you have on Bioshock? Like what kind of details did they give you before you were allowed to go make the level?
So I think Irrational was a special case because the studio prides itself on their narrative very highly, and that's kind of the experience they're trying to sell, this great narrative and, you know, good game design. And so narrative was always the focus. And so in that specific studio, usually what the level designers we would get is a general beat sheet, or like you would see in a script from a movie, saying like, here's the general high level things that, Ken Levine or the narrative designers or writers wanted to happen in the level, and usually at that point, level designer, we would brainstorm with the narrative designer to try to figure out, okay, well, how can we assign that meaning in what the player does in a space, and how do we get the player from A to B, and into that point where like, oh hey, the player needs to go here and see the scene, like, okay, well, what does that mean? And so that's when like a general high level idea of what narrative elements are gonna happen in a level occurs, and then so you can try to plan for it, but just like anything else, it's always iterating and changing, and so you have to go back and fix stuff. So it's not like you get some sort of set in stone document and then you can design things from the start on that. But I know that other studios have done it a little bit differently, where in a single player game, they might have the level designer just come up with a really cool idea for a level, either a cool mechanic to use or a cool environment or a cool new weapon or ability, and then the writers or narrative designers would take that and then write on top of it to assign meaning. So it really depends on the studio. Each studio is a bit different in how that works out.
Fascinating.
With asymmetrical multiplayer level design, how do you guys go about testing and determining when a level is in fact close to fair with each team, especially when it's asymmetrical, and there might be different skill levels between players?
I think the skill levels things is tough, but if you're relying on people in your studio, your team, or even outward people, getting a general gist as to the type of player they are. Are they the run and gun style player? Are they the cautious, let's stay back and just kind of snipe people type player, and try to, or a really good player, a newbie player, and try to balance the teams to have a general idea of the same amount of people. And then heat maps are often used a lot to see where some of them track like where players move, and then you can see the progression in a level, or just to see where players die a lot. And if you see in an asymmetrical multiplayer level, this power position that you created on one side that's equidistant, it seems like it's equidistant, but yet more of the red team is dying as compared to the blue. You know that's probably not that balanced as you think it is for one reason or another.
You mentioned the reduced narrative and multiplayer maps, and I can imagine it's incredibly frustrating to not be able to tell a story in that space. But I was starting to think about like Overwatch. All their maps have little details here and there and stuff you can see. Do you think is that something you'd like to see in multiplayer games in general, or do you chalk that up to just Blizzard having ultimate polish time on everything?
I think it depends on the type of game, right? Like each game you're trying to create a different experience, and so at least that's how I feel. Like that's what Overwatch is known for. Its characters, its personality, and the overall broader world that they're creating. And so that's, besides like the good mechanics and gameplay and stuff, I think that's one of the ways that they stand out, I think. But like a game like Doom or something is known for its like really really good, quick, polished experience. It's really quick to get into, and it just flows really well. And so like that's what that game is known for. And so having somebody to stop to take the time to go look at this like scene over here in multiplayer would be distracting from that. Let's just constantly be moving around and doing stuff. And so that's why it's highly dependent on the type of game that you're creating. And I think that part of I said this before, part of a level designer's job is to try to figure out the high level vision and pillars of what the game you're trying to make, and try to figure out how can you create a level to support that. But I think that variety is great, and I think that having multiplayer games with story is great as well.
Can you share an example of a tough decision you had to make as a level designer?
Sounds like an interview. And how do you overcome it?
Because I think level design is just like fun, creative stuff, and I'm wondering like, what's those tough decisions that you have to see with the pros and cons?
A lot of the tough decisions are balancing between different priorities on a team. So, art has their priorities of making things look really amazingly beautiful. And, if your game is narrative has goals that they want to support, and the systems designers want to show off their really cool systemic stuff and make sure that you create a level that has enough systemic stuff to support their things that they create. And so that's like most of the challenges, I think, is trying to balance and make compromises in between things. And so sometimes trying to realize what are the really important things to really stand your ground on. Like, I really need this to be here like this, so I know it doesn't look as great, but we need this. And then other times letting go and saying, hey, so you can just like change all this over here, it doesn't matter as much. And so trying to balance between that. Do I get the job?
You already got it.
Yeah.
Do you have any experience creating a multiplayer level that's based on a single player level or a particular set piece from the single player portion of the game? And if there's any certain challenges or opportunities that come from that?
I do not. I don't have any. Yeah, I don't. But I can imagine the challenge. I feel like the challenge as a player is usually it feels unnerving when something isn't exactly the same as you remembered it in single player, but yet but you have to change the level in single player to work for a multiplayer level. And I guess if it was a game like Bioshock Infinite, where narratively you could support that being a different environment and layout because multiple universes, but I think that's what I always struggle with, I think. I would rather create a space that's in a similar area but not exactly the same, but I'm not hugely strongly tied to that opinion. I think I would have to work on some to have a better answer for you.
Sort of a question that's both specific and general. Bioshock Infinite is one of my favorite stories, just from any medium. But one of the reasons that it works so well is because the environments are just filled with these incidental details that have nothing to do with the overall story. So I'm curious, to what extent do those little incidental details about unnamed characters come from the script writers, or to what extent do they come from the artists as they're working on it? Like, what's the relationship there between those two origin points?
Yeah. So at Irrational, everyone was responsible for telling the story in whatever way they could in their medium. And so for level design, it was how can I create opportunities to tell stories? How can I identify spaces that can tell stories? How can I use loot to tell stories? How can I script NPCs and build out the space before you get there? How can I have the enemies before you start an encounter? How can I have them assign things that they're doing that is meaningful to the story and relevant to it? How do I design a space that makes sense for the overall world that you're designing in? And I'm sure that every department would have their own different things that they could say, but I know that we did do passes in the level design department of trying to identify and come up with small little tidbit moments that would be cool to tell stories. Like, I didn't come up with the guitar one. I think a narrative designer probably did, but there's like other scenes where I'm like, oh, it would be cool if, this story was told here, so I'm gonna like prop out some stuff here. It's very easy, I think, for level design for us to just place static objects and to tell stories, or using NPCs to tell stories. And obviously environment art also comes way more into play on that, and there's like a zillion talks on environmental storytelling. But yeah, it's kind of, the impetus is on everyone, but the impetus is on the writers and the narrative designers to communicate what the vision is for what they want, so that we can try to work within the little moments
When you were making the remastered Call of Duty, how much were you allowed to bring your own ideas into already made maps?
Very little. Because in a remaster, you want to preserve the overall feeling of the experience, and so I think art had a lot more freedom because original Call of Duty Modern Warfare came out in like 2007. Yeah. Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and so the level of detail that you could support in a level at that time was a lot different than what current engines can render now, and so art had a lot more freedom of trying to build out more complexity into the spaces. But my job as a level designer on that wasn't to create new content, but to be the vision holder of what the original experience was like and make sure that, when more detail gets added in, that, the overall feeling is still the same as the original, and that, the enemies generally work the same and go in generally the same places, and maybe some additional details are added in, new animations or other things like that. But no, on a remaster, usually you don't have a huge amount of creative freedom to add new content, but it depends on the project. I think many games, maybe games that are more like live, like on an MMO or something. If you're creating a remaster for like Lord of the Rings Online or something, which I haven't done, but if I were, like, that might be an opportunity to create new additional stuff on top of that. So it really depends on the vision of what the partner, the studio that is paying us to help help them create this content wants.
How and why did you become a level designer as opposed to some other aspect of game design?
Yeah, so I started out as in school going into biology because I'm like, I don't know, I guess I like science, and I like, I was kind of drawn to both kind of animal behavior biology and genetics, and so I was interested in the future technology of genetics, but the everyday stuff that you do is it's kind of tedious and boring and long term. But I like the combination of technology, and I found that the school I went to only had a programming or art course, and so I started out in art because it's more accessible to a lot of people, especially somebody who did not grow up with a very technical background at all. It's very intimidating I think it's a lot better now, I think, with a lot of the initiatives to get people who aren't used to technology or programming and stuff, being exposed to it earlier on. But when I was growing up, we also weren't well off either, so we didn't even have a great computer. So like art was like the most accessible entryway for me into it, and so I thought, oh, I want to be environment artist, I guess. And then I realized, no, I don't really like making props. I just like using them and kind of creating a space that like kind of merges in between tech and art, and so I could use some of that logical analytical brain and that creative artistic brain into one role, because like when you're growing up, at least when I was growing up, you're taught either you're an artistic creative person or a logical analytical person, and so, but there's so many roles that are in between, and so I think level design for me is one of those in between roles where you get to have your hands in everything, and you get to create this experience that you're thinking of a high level overall vision, and sometimes you also get to kind of subtly manipulate players for good. Like if you do many tricks to kind of encourage players to do something, and you see them let you do that, and then they like notice something, you're like, wow, that's awesome, that's an awesome feeling, like I'm thinking back, I forget if it's Portal 1 or 2, but there's like at the end of the game when you're fighting GLaDOS, like you have to like shoot the moon with with the portal gun, and then Gladys gets sucked to the moon. But there's like all this subtle stuff with the framing of the thing and like a glimmer on the moon that I didn't even realize was happening to me, and so I just did it without thinking, and I was like, whoa! And so like that kind of moment where you can kind of encourage or tap into people's unconscious brains and psychology, and so that's, I think, what level design, that's why I really enjoy it.
Assuming you have you ever worked on an RTS map, and how does that compare to other like FPS maps?
I have not. I would not even know where to start.
You talked about putting places for combat encounters. How much do you actually like make the combat encounters versus like somebody else?
Yeah, usually the level designers will also design the combats and script the combats as well. The systems designers or AI programmers will maybe design the inherent AI behavior, but a lot of the times level designers will design the layout and also the combats as well. Sometimes studios might specify into like a sub-level design category as like a combat scripter or a combat designer, but I feel like that's a subcategory of level design to me.
I have another question about Bioshock Infinite. I don't know if you can answer or not, but give you the opportunity. Bioshock Infinite is it's really violent, and it's different from a lot of really violent games in that the environments in it are very pleasant places generally. They're pleasant civic places, not places you expect that to happen. So I'm just curious, to what extent is the violence in Infinite, is that to match up with genre convention, and to what extent is that intended to convey narrative?
That feeling was definitely intentional. I can't 100% speak to the high-level vision, but I know what was communicated to me was that it's supposed to feel like this peaceful, serene, beautiful world that is just unnerving and subtly wrong, and that there's this underlying brutality underneath all this seeming peacefulness. And so that's why there's that moment with the lottery scene, and you have that first moment where you have you get the skyhook and you just hit somebody
in the face.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so that was a moment that was intentionally jarring to that degree. But I know that there was definitely discussions of some of the more brutal, I forget what they're called, but the optional takedowns where you can hold the button and do these really brutal things. And I know there were many of us who were I want to opt into that experience. I don't want to have that always happen. And so that was definitely intentional to be an opt-in type thing. But I know it's also, it definitely turns a lot of people off from that kind of experience when there's a lot of violence in a game. But I think that the world of Columbia is a very violent place, especially in terms of ideologies and the way they treat people there. And I think that this is my personal opinion, but I feel like the combat kind of supports that brutality. But I know that looking back, there's also, I think, some sensitivity things I think that could have been revised.
You just clawed this man in the face. Do you continue to want to play this game or not? I guess it's your choice.
Well, yeah, that moment was definitely the line in the sand intentional moment of this is the type of game it's going to be. So
shit has got real.
Yeah, I know that I was having both my younger sisters play the game, and they're not really gamers, but I like to have them play the games I work on because I like to see what new players are like. And one of my sisters was playing the beginning, and she was loving going to the fair and walking around and looking at all the people and everything, and then she got to that moment and was like, nope. And then my younger sister took over and and she's like, ha ha.
I was just listening to the guy sing the Beach Boys. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's why it's important to have a variety of experiences in games. Like, I love walking simulators. I love, peaceful narrative games. Like Tacoma, I thought it was great, and that has no violence in it. But I think the older I get, the more I feel uncomfortable with violence in games. But I think it's because games are getting more and more realistic, and so that's what I have a problem with. But I also think that just like in anything in fantasy genres or whatever, if it's not real, then it's probably gonna be okay.
I'm gonna close this out if anyone else has a question. I'm not gonna make you do the whole thing, but you did do such a great job for your microtalks a year and a half ago about imposter syndrome, and you got a really great pop about it. Maybe just to touch on, how often do you feel this, and what are your coping strategies for when you feel like you don't belong and aren't supposed to be here, even though you're an experienced professional?
I think many of the points of my talks, were that so many people feel it, and that everyone feels it at one point or another, and so normalizing it, that this is just an everyday occurrence, and that because our industry is constantly changing and the tech is changing, and what works for one game doesn't work for another. Level design, I've never worked on an RTS game, so I might feel like an imposter working on that for the first time. But it helps, I think, if you've worked on a couple things to look back and write down what you've done. But I think also knowing that just like in anything, there's stages, and that if you have difficulties, that's the first step of being good at something. Oh, that was Jake from Adventure Time. It's dude, if you suck at something, it's the first step to being great at something. So it's recognizing that something isn't the best means that you're at step 2. Step 1 means you don't even recognize that your work isn't ideal. If you're new, and you're this is awesome, but then step 2 is this isn't great. And I feel with every, I shared this image on Twitter, but there's the steps of developing, and it was oh, this is easy, this is great, oh, this isn't bad, oh, this really sucks, oh, this is the worst thing in the world ever, and then it gets better, and it's oh, this isn't bad, oh, this is actually really fun. And so each time there's a cycle of it starts out easy, and then you're this is the worst piece of crap in the world, and then it slowly starts going up. But it's really disheartening in that middle stage to try to raise yourself up from that. But I think recognizing that that's the cycle of things helps a lot, and knowing that you will get out of that negative feeling.
All right, so tip Katie, our bartender, get your parking validation on your way out, and give Beth one more hand. Please pick up stuff before you leave. Gordon and I will have to do it otherwise. Thanks very much, everyone.
I'm going to try to remember. Down. So long.
It's an unusual one.
Yeah.
Dial it down.